Where did the ancient gods go? Right now, I'm standing in a place that once kept me away for almost 6 months. The first time I tried to get here, I started throwing up on the road. The second time, I could barely stay awake behind the wheel. I had to pull over 4 separate times, lie down in the back seat, and sleep. It honestly felt like the place itself did not want me to reach it. But when I finally made it here, I discovered something I never expected. Beneath this place is an enormous golden crystal of power, and beside it there is a presence. A being so vast that if you tried to translate its energetic scale into physical size, it would stand several miles tall. Our ancestors would have called it a god. My name is Orlov. For more than 15 years, I have explored ancient sacred sites, forgotten settlements, and what I call the crystals of the earth. I have visited hundreds of these places across different countries. But this is one of the most powerful sites I have ever encountered. I will not reveal its exact location. After some of my previous videos, entire busloads of people began showing up at places I had discussed. That will not happen here. Stay with me until the end of this video. As you watch, allow yourself to walk through this place in your subtle body. Observe it, feel it, and if you can, connect with the ancient presence that our ancestors knew as the giver of human blessings. If it chooses to reveal the physical location to you, it will. And if it does not, then for now, this is the only way you are meant to experience it. But today, I want to answer the bigger question. Where did the ancient gods go? Why could our ancestors interact with them while modern people see nothing more than an old park, a tree, or a stone? And what if the gods never left? What if they have been here the entire time, and the only thing that disappeared was our ability to see them? So, where did the ancient gods actually go? Seriously, where did they go? There was a time when people lived in the same world as their gods. Not in the sense that the god showed up in the town square every Tuesday, waved to everyone, and went about his business. Of course not. But to our ancestors, the gods were not fictional characters from some old book. They were real forces, real presences, something you could interact with, something you could turn to when something important happened in your life. And this existed everywhere. The Slavs had their gods, the Greeks had theirs, so did the Egyptians, the Romans, the Norse, and countless other cultures. And these people were not just sitting around a fire telling each other entertaining stories. They built sanctuaries, they chose specific locations, they placed sacred stones, they planted trees, they created entire priestly traditions. They spent time, labor, wealth, and generations of effort on this. So to them, it was not a fairy tale, it was part of life. But today, we look back and say, well, ancient people were primitive. They did not understand thunder, so they invented Perun. They did not understand the sun, so they created another god for that. Very convenient. But I have always had one question. Were they really that stupid? For thousands of years, cultures across the entire planet built temples, sanctuaries, altars, rituals, and systems of knowledge, all because they were bored? Come on, that makes no sense. They were clearly encountering something. They felt something. They saw something. They entered into contact with something. And then, at some point, that contact disappeared. This is where the story becomes interesting, because maybe the gods never went anywhere. Maybe we simply lost the ability to perceive them. Modern people have become almost completely deaf to the space around them. A person walks into a forest and sees trees. He approaches an ancient stone and thinks, it's just a rock. He sees an enormous old oak and thinks, cool tree, let's take a picture. He visits an old estate, a cliff, a river, or an ancient park. Beautiful place. Then he goes home. But why was everything placed here? Why does that tree stand in that exact location? Why is there a stone beside it? Why was the estate built on this particular ground? Why did people, century after century, continue choosing the same kinds of places? Most people never ask. Someone called it a park, so it is a park. Someone called it a historical monument, so that is all it becomes. End of story. But ancient people looked at the world differently. They understood that a place could be alive, that a forest could have its own power, a river could have its own presence, a mountain could have its own force, a specific location could have a guardian, and beyond all of that, there could be beings of an entirely different order, the beings people called gods. But today we expect a god to appear directly in front of us, to step out from behind an oak tree, introduce himself, preferably explain where he came from and what exactly he wants. And if no one appears, we decide the whole thing is nonsense. But why should a being from another level of reality look like an ordinary human being? Why should it even be visible to physical eyes? We cannot see radio signals. We cannot see the data moving between our phones and the internet. We cannot see countless processes passing through our bodies and the space around us right now. But they are still real. The human eye simply was not designed to detect them. The gods may work in a similar way. They may be nearby. They may be connected to a specific place. They may operate through a territory, a crystal, a tree, or a flow of energy. And the person can stand right beside them and notice absolutely nothing. Not because nothing is there, but because he does not yet have the ability to perceive it. So maybe we have been asking the wrong question. Not where did the ancient gods go, but what happened to the kind of human being who knew how to see them? And to understand that, we first need to ask a deeper question. What were the gods really? So what are the gods really? Because when people try to answer this question, they usually fall into one of two extremes. Some imagine a god as a gigantic man sitting somewhere above the clouds, watching everyone. Others say that God is completely unknowable, some kind of cloud, an absolute, light, love, everything at once and nothing specific. But in my experience, it is much simpler than that. A god is a living, intelligent being, a consciousness that has moved much farther along the path of development than an ordinary human being. That is all. Human beings are already very different from one another. We love saying that everyone is equal and everyone is basically the same. But that is clearly not true. Think about a school. There is a child in first grade, there is a teenager in high school, and there is a graduating senior. They are all human beings, but their knowledge, abilities, way of thinking and responsibilities are completely different. A first grader may look at a senior and understand almost nothing about what that older student is doing. Not because the child is bad, not because the child is stupid. He simply has not reached that level yet. Human consciousness works in a similar way. One person lives mainly through the body. His greatest concerns are food, sleep, warmth, safety, and being left alone. Another person begins to understand money, exchange, opportunity, and relationships. He understands how to turn one resource into another. A third person goes further. It is no longer enough for him simply to earn money. He wants to influence, to lead, to create projects, to change the world around him. Then sensitivity begins to appear. A person starts noticing more than words and actions. He feels people. He feels the atmosphere of a place. He senses where he should go and where he should stay away from. Later, a person learns not only to feel energy, but to work with it, to direct it, to gather it, to change his own state and the state of the space around him. And above that comes the ability to perceive the deeper structure of reality. Not only what is happening, but why it is happening. How people, events, places, and energetic currents are connected. At a certain level, a person becomes capable of interacting with more than other humans in the physical world. He begins to notice other forms of life, spirits of place, guardians, beings that do not have a physical body in the form we are used to. And this ladder does not end with the human being. That is the important part. For some reason, we decided that humanity is the highest point of everything. We appeared on Earth, walked around for a while, invented the smartphone, and apparently that is it. There is nowhere else for consciousness to go. That idea is almost ridiculous. If the body can evolve, why could consciousness not evolve as well? If a human being can develop from a child into an adult during one lifetime, why could consciousness not continue developing through countless lives, states, and levels of experience? At some point, a physical body may simply become too small for that consciousness. It no longer fits inside that form. It no longer needs hands, legs, a stomach, or a passport. It exists on another level, but it is still alive, still intelligent, still capable of acting. And beings like this were often called gods by ancient people. But even that word is too broad. Calling every higher being a god is like calling every person on earth by the same title and pretending there are no differences between them. There are differences, enormous ones. Some beings are connected to one specific place, an ancient forest, a mountain, a lake, a sacred stone. Others work through a much larger territory, an entire region, a river system, an elemental force. Some are connected to nations and civilizations. And then there are vast forms of consciousness that operate through planetary processes. A human being may call all of them gods, but the difference between them may be as great as the difference between a small child, an adult, and the ruler of an entire nation. So when we use the word God, we should understand that it is not one specific job title. It describes a scale of consciousness, a scale of power, a scale of influence over space, time, and events. And there is one more important point. A God is not merely an impersonal stream of energy. Yes, it has its own frequency, its own current, its own field of power. But behind that power is consciousness. It can perceive, it can understand, it can make decisions, it can enter into contact. So this is not electricity flowing through an outlet. It is a living being of another order. And when you begin looking at the ancient gods from this perspective, many things start making sense. Why one was connected with thunder, another with wealth and abundance, another with the earth, family or fertility, another with war, craftsmanship, knowledge or fate. That does not mean each god was simply a poetic symbol for some natural phenomenon. It means that a particular force was part of that being's nature, its range, its domain, the channel through which it expressed itself in our world. And then the main question is no longer whether beings like this exist. The real question is different. Why can an ordinary person not see them? How can someone stand beside an enormous living consciousness and feel absolutely nothing? That is what we need to understand next. Why can't most people see the gods? For the same reason, we cannot see countless other things that are surrounding us right now. The human eye sees only a narrow range of light. The human ear hears only a limited range of sound. Your phone receives signals that you cannot feel, hear, or see in any way. So, the world is much larger than what our ordinary senses are capable of detecting. And the same principle applies to the gods. A person can stand beside an enormous presence and notice absolutely nothing. Not because the place is empty, not because the gods are fictional, but because that person is not tuned to the right frequency. Imagine this. You are standing in an old park. Beside you is an enormous oak tree. Deep beneath the ground is a powerful crystal. A current of energy is moving through the entire place. And you look around and think, it's an oak tree, it's a park, nice place, and that is all. Another person stands in the exact same spot and says, something feels strange here. The air feels dense. I can feel heat moving through my body. My mind suddenly became quiet. That person has already detected something. A third person may be able to sense where the current is coming from, where it is moving, where the center of the place is located. A fourth person may perceive more than energy. He may see the structure itself, the crystal, the tree, the connections between different levels of reality. And only at a very advanced level can a person enter into direct contact with the consciousness standing behind the entire system. So, the difference is not that a god revealed itself to one person and deliberately hid from another. The difference is the level of perception. One person's receiver is completely turned off. Another person hears static and occasionally catches part of the signal. A third has a properly tuned receiver. And the fourth is operating an entire communication station. That is why I always say that being interested in spirituality and actually perceiving the unseen world are two completely different things. You can read spiritual books for 20 years. You can memorize the names of every ancient god. You can learn hundreds of rituals. You can put on beautiful robes, carry a staff, and declare yourself a high priest. But if your energetic system is undeveloped, you will not see anyone. At best, you will see your own imagination. A real priest is not a job title. It is not a costume. It is not a certificate. And it is definitely not a label in a social media bio. It is a level of human development. A level at which a person can withstand contact with an enormous consciousness without being shattered by the force of it. Because contact with a being like that is not a pleasant guided meditation with soft music playing in the background. It is a completely different volume of energy, a different volume of information, a different density of presence. And if a person is not ready for it, the contact can overwhelm him, physically, emotionally, psychologically. So, nature has designed this system very intelligently. Until a person is ready, that range of perception simply remains closed. He sees nothing. And sometimes that is a very good thing. Because if you gave a first grader the entire curriculum of a university, he would not instantly become smarter. He would just become completely overwhelmed and understand nothing. The evolution of consciousness works the same way. First, a person learns to feel himself, then other people and the surrounding space, then energy. Then he begins to understand how all of those things are connected. Only after that can real contact with higher beings become possible. You could say the first stage is sensitivity. A person begins noticing what he used to walk past without a second thought. Then comes the ability to work with energy. Not simply feeling warmth in your hands and becoming excited about it, but actually understanding what that energy is doing and how to interact with it. After that comes the ability to perceive structure. Not just isolated sensations, but the whole system. Where the source is, where the channel is, where the living consciousness is. And only after that does the priestly level begin. The level at which a human being can interact with gods. Not imagine it, not pretend, but actually make contact, receive information, conduct energy, and transmit it into the human world. There are very few people capable of this. Very few. Perhaps a few dozen across the entire planet at any given moment. Maybe a few hundred. But honestly, no one can know that with certainty. Because this is not the result of attending one workshop. It is not even the result of practicing for a few years. It is. So when someone says, I meditated for the first time yesterday, and the great God immediately started speaking to me. Well, maybe, but most of the time he was speaking to himself. And that is not necessarily a bad thing. You simply have to be honest about the difference between genuine contact and your own mind creating a beautiful image. The greatest mistake is believing that the gods are obligated to answer everyone. A person makes a request, closes his eyes, waits for 2 minutes, then says, nothing answered, so none of this is real. But the problem may not be that no answer came. The problem may be that the person is not capable of receiving it. It is like a radio station broadcasting 24 hours a day, while you do not own a radio. You can become as angry with the station as you want. That does not mean the station has disappeared. The signal is still being transmitted. You simply are not receiving it. And this is exactly why ancient people did not build sanctuaries in random locations. They searched for places where the earth itself amplified human perception. Places where the current could lift a person beyond his ordinary state. Places where even someone who was not yet capable of direct contact could at least feel that reality was far larger than he had ever imagined. These were the true places of power. Why did people search for the gods at places of power? Because those places already contain the mechanism needed for contact. And what is interesting is that the same basic pattern appears across many completely different ancient traditions. In the Slavic tradition, there is Alatyr. In ancient Greece, there was the omphalos. In other traditions, it appears as the cornerstone, the sacred stone, the stone in the center of the world. The names are different, but the underlying principle is the same. At the foundation of the place is a crystal of power, a stone, a source of energy. And beside it, there is almost always a tree, a great oak, an ash, a pine, an olive tree. Some ancient tree physically rooted in that exact location. And the system itself is actually very simple. The crystal provides the energy. The tree distributes that energy through different levels. The crystal is the source. The tree is the vertical axis. Together, they create what you might call an elevator between worlds. A person enters that place, steps into the current, begins filling with energy. The system starts moving, and gradually his state of consciousness begins to shift. Not through fantasy, not because he is sitting there pretending to travel somewhere. His state actually changes. The frequency changes. The density of energy changes. And if the person's system is sufficiently developed, he may be able to move beyond the ordinary limits of physical perception, to rise higher, sometimes to descend lower, to enter into contact with other levels, with spirits, with guardians, with gods. This is why priests and magicians were not simply looking for beautiful scenery. They needed a crystal. They needed a tree. They needed an actual point of transition. And once that point was found, they began shaping the physical space around it. They created a clearly defined sacred zone. The simplest version was a circle of stones. You found large stones in a nearby field, carried them to the site, placed them in a circle, and immediately a boundary appeared between ordinary space and the inner space. But if people had more resources, they did not stop at one boundary. They created several, usually at least 3. The outer boundary separated the site from the ordinary world. The second changed the density and frequency even more. The third brought the person closer to the center. It functioned almost like a series of airlocks. You did not step directly from ordinary reality into the strongest current. You moved through it gradually. One level, then another, then another. And the closer you came to the center, the more different the space became from everything outside. Think about a modern clean room where microchips, precision lenses, or medical technology are produced. You do not walk in directly from the street wearing dirty shoes. First, you pass through one corridor, then another. The air changes, the pressure changes, the temperature changes, the level of cleanliness changes. You move through several controlled zones before reaching the center. The same principle was used here, only the transition was energetic rather than purely physical. The priest passed through one boundary, then the second, then the third, and with every step his state changed more deeply. It was as though he were rising in an elevator, even though physically he was simply walking across the ground. And in the center stood the crystal, the tree, the altar, or the actual point where the current emerged. That was where contact became possible. This is why, when you study ancient temple complexes around the world, you often see the same basic design. Multiple boundaries, walls, moats, courtyards, gates, passageways, and the central space that only a few people were allowed to enter. You see this in major sacred complexes across the world, ancient Greece, ancient Egypt, Angkor Wat, the imperial palace systems of China and Japan, sacred cities. From the outside, it looks like architecture, beautiful walls, courtyards, temples. But on a deeper level, it is an energetic machine. A machine designed to gradually separate a person from the ordinary world and move him into another state. And the more powerful the crystal was, the more serious the structure around it had to be. Because a strong shift in energy had to be contained, regulated, divided into levels. A person could not simply stumble into the center like a sack of potatoes. The transition had to happen gradually. Otherwise, the current could overwhelm him. But the same principle could also be created in a very simple form. You find a strong point. You identify the center. Then you create several stone boundaries around it. For example, a larger outer circle, a smaller second circle, and a third circle close to the center. The number of stones could also change. Perhaps 16 in the outer ring, then fewer in the next, and fewer again near the center. Not because the numbers looked mystical or attractive, but because each new layer made the space denser, more focused, and more organized. It created a kind of energetic fence. But the fence was not meant to keep people out. It separated one level of space from another. And this is something people are beginning to restore today. They are finding old sites, returning stones, rebuilding circles, restoring altars. Sometimes without even fully understanding why a stone feels like it belongs in one particular place. The body and the space itself often begin revealing the old design. So ancient people search for the gods at places of power for a very practical reason. Not because they simply enjoyed sitting beneath oak trees, but because beneath the oak was a crystal. The crystal provided energy. The tree created the vertical axis. The surrounding boundaries changed the frequency of the space. And the priest was able to rise toward a level that an ordinary person in an ordinary state could not reach. This is exactly what I explore in my book, The Secret Guide. I explain how to recognize a crystal of power within the structure of an old park, an ancient settlement, an estate, or a forgotten sanctuary. Why stones, trees, water, cliffs, and multiple layers of space appear together again and again. How to locate the center. Why one place gives you energy immediately, while another begins by cleansing you, slowing you down, or refusing to let you enter at all. The QR code is on the screen now. You will also find the link below this video. And if you want to do more than simply hear stories about these places, if you want to begin recognizing the pattern around you, this book was created for exactly that. Because one crystal like this began working with me long before I ever reached it. And for almost 6 months, the place simply refused to let me enter. The first time, I started throwing up on the road. And this did not happen when I reached the place. I was not even close yet. I was driving there from Minsk, almost 400 kilometers. For Belarus, that is a serious distance, almost across the entire country. And the closer I got, the worse I felt. At first, it was just a strange state. Then came the nausea. Then my body really started reacting. To put it simply, I was being cleaned out from both ends. And at that point, I was not thinking about higher dimensions, ancient gods, or spiritual mysteries. I just understood one thing. I was not going any farther. So I turned around and drove back. Even though I had made the trip for one reason, I had already seen this place through inner perception. I knew there was an extremely powerful golden crystal there. I knew the site was serious. And that was exactly why I wanted to reach it physically. But I could not. The first time, the place simply did not let me in. After some time passed, I decided to try again. I thought, fine, maybe the first time was just bad luck. Maybe I was tired. Maybe I ate something wrong. So I drove there again. And this time, something completely different began. I started shutting down. Not ordinary drowsiness. Not that mild feeling where you could use a cup of coffee. I mean, my eyes were closing. My body was switching off. And I knew that continuing to drive would be dangerous. So I pulled over, climbed into the back seat, fell asleep, woke up, drove farther. Then, after a while, the exact same thing happened again. I stopped, slept, woke up, continued. I think I had to pull over and sleep 4 separate times. And eventually I understood again. That's it. I am not reaching this place today either. So I turned around. Then there was another attempt. And another. Every time something different happened. Sometimes my physical state collapsed. Sometimes the road unfolded in such a way that continuing became pointless. Sometimes my body started malfunctioning again. And this continued for almost 6 months. Think about that. I already knew where the place was. I knew exactly where I needed to go. The distance was long, but completely manageable. You get into the car and drive. It sounds simple. But in reality, I could not reach it for half a year. And that was when I finally stopped believing it was all coincidence. 1 strange event. Fine. 2. It happens. But when you are turned around again and again through almost the same pattern, you begin asking questions. What is actually there? Why was my body reacting before I had physically entered the place? Why did the current begin working on me from such a distance? Today I understand this much better. A powerful place of power does not begin at a sign, a gate, or an ancient oak tree. Its field can be enormous. You are only approaching it, and your system is already entering into contact. And if there is something inside you that does not match the frequency of that place, it begins rising to the surface. That is what was happening to me. The place was not punishing me. It was not offended. It was not trying to prove that I was unworthy. This had nothing to do with human emotions. Its frequency was simply much higher than my state at that time. And the moment I entered its field, everything incompatible began being forced out. My body was trying to cleanse itself, to reorganize, to release whatever was preventing me from going farther. And when my system could not handle the current, it shut me down through sleep. That is a very simple protective mechanism. When the conscious mind cannot cope with the process, the system puts you to sleep, so you do not continue moving forward in a condition where you could harm yourself. And only several months later did something inside me finally change. I got into the car again. I started driving towards the same place. And this time, the entire journey felt different. No vomiting, no constant stops. No sense that something was forcing me to turn back. I simply drove there. And that was when the most interesting part began. Because at the site, I physically saw what I had previously perceived only inwardly. An old park, a cliff, the tree, an enormous stone, and the entire structure that had kept me away for almost 6 months. When I finally arrived, I saw the same place I had already seen within. When I finally reached the site, I had a very strange feeling, because I was now seeing physically what I had previously perceived only inwardly. In front of me was an old park. Long ago there had been an estate here. The park sits on top of a high bluff, and for Belarus the drop is surprisingly dramatic. Most of our landscape is calm and relatively flat, but here the land suddenly falls away. Far below, a wild river moves through the valley, and the entire place immediately feels like a boundary. The park above, the water below, and the cliff between them, as if several different layers of reality are touching in one location. Then I saw the enormous old oak. It stood exactly where I had expected it to be, not simply somewhere nearby. It was at the very center of the site, like the tree, like a vertical axis through which the current could move upward and downward. Beside it was a large stone, and that mattered too, because the stone functioned as an altar point, a physical anchor connected to something much deeper beneath the surface. And once all of these elements came together, the structure became completely clear. The oak, the stone, the cliff, the river, and the powerful golden crystal beneath it all. Everything I had perceived in advance was physically present. Not just one isolated object, the entire design of the place. That was the most important part. Because when you are sitting at home with your eyes closed, the mind can create almost anything. But I had traveled almost across the entire country to a place I had never visited before, and found the same structure waiting for me. That was when I understood why my body had begun reacting while I was still on the road. The field of this crystal extends far beyond the park itself. It works over a much larger area. You have not reached the oak yet. You have not approached the stone. You have not stepped into the center, and the place is already working with you. The crystal itself is enormous. In my perception, this is not a small local point extending only a few yards. This is a major node. Its influence does not stop at the park or the surrounding land. Its scale reaches across the entire planet. And the first time I entered the site, I felt that scale immediately. The space was dense. There was an enormous amount of energy. The body began reacting very quickly. The mind became quieter. My entire state started changing. It was as if I had entered an ordinary old park, but only a few minutes later I was no longer standing in the same reality from which I had begun. But at that time I still had not perceived the most important part. I could see the crystal. I could feel the tree. I understood where the altar point was. I could see how the entire structure connected with the river and the cliff. But all of that was only the entrance. Because the most important thing was not the oak. It was not the stone. It was not even the golden crystal. The most important question was this: who was present here through that crystal? For years I could feel the power, but I could not see who was behind it. For several years I returned to this place and felt only the power itself. It was immense, dense, golden. You could step into the current, fill yourself with energy, bring your system back into balance, and sometimes understand something important about yourself. But at that time, I still could not perceive who was standing behind that power. Then, during one visit, everything went much deeper. I stayed at the site for a long time. I walked through the park, stopped beside the oak, worked with the crystal, and gradually the entire system began to intensify. At first, there was simply an enormous amount of energy. Then, the space around me seemed to change. The ordinary park did not disappear. The trees were still there. The river was still moving below the cliff. But my perception shifted. It was as though I remained physically present in the same place, while simultaneously beginning to perceive another layer of it. And that was when I saw him. Not a light, not a beautiful symbol, not some vague shape that the imagination could easily complete on its own. A vast living being, intelligent, extremely ancient, completely calm, and so powerful that beside it, the human scale stopped meaning anything. If I tried to translate its size into ordinary physical measurements, it would have stood several miles tall. You are standing there below as an ordinary human being, while beside you is a consciousness for which the entire park is only a tiny point. But the strongest impression did not come from its size. It came from its density, from the amount of energy contained within it. The calm, the power. There was no restlessness, no need to prove anything, no performance, only presence. And that presence was more than enough. That was when I finally understood that a god is not an image from an old book, not a character invented by people thousands of years ago. It is a real consciousness of another order. It simply does not exist in the same way an ordinary human being does. It has a different scale, a different frequency, a different density, a different form of life. And this being was connected to the golden crystal. The current moved through it. Through that crystal, the being interacted with the place, with the surrounding territory, and with the people capable of entering into contact with it. The way I perceived it, this was the giver of human blessings, Dazhbog, a force connected not merely with abstract spirituality, but with very real earthly things: life, health, abundance, the resources a person needs to grow, act, and continue moving forward. And there is something very important to understand here. He did not appear at the moment I finally saw him. He did not arrive specifically for me. He did not descend from somewhere above. He had been there the entire time. When I failed to reach the place on my first attempt, when I was vomiting on the road, when I kept falling asleep behind the wheel, when I finally entered the park and saw the oak, the stone, and the crystal, he was already present. I simply could not perceive him yet. My frequency was not high enough. I did not have enough energy. My level of perception was not developed enough. At first, I could see only the lowest layer. First, the physical park, then the current, then the crystal, then the entire structure of the place. And only later was I able to rise to the level where the consciousness behind the energy became visible. That is how it works. The gods are not hiding. They are not sitting somewhere waiting for a human being to call them with exactly the right words. They exist on their own level, and a person is either capable of reaching that level or he is not. On that day I was able to reach it, and after that I no longer had any question about whether beings like this truly exist. A different question remained. How did people in the ancient world enter into contact with them, if only a very small number of individuals could reach that level directly? So, how did entire nations communicate with the gods? This raises an obvious question. If only a tiny number of people could directly perceive a being like this, how did entire nations communicate with their gods? Was every second person in the ancient world some kind of master magician? Of course not. Although perhaps in a much more distant age, human perception was more developed than it is today. But most people still lived ordinary lives. They worked, raised children, built homes, argued, made peace, got sick, went to war. They wanted good harvests, healthy families, and some kind of stability in their lives. So, contact with the gods usually did not happen directly. That was the role of the priests, and I do not mean someone who put on impressive clothing, memorized a few sacred words, and began performing the role of a great initiate. A real priest was a conduit. He could enter the necessary state, raise his frequency, hold the contact, receive information, and then translate it into ordinary human language. Because try explaining to people what comes from a consciousness operating on a completely different scale. It is not like receiving a text message on your phone. An enormous amount of information may arrive all at once. An image, a state, a complete understanding, a chain of future events. And the priest had to do more than receive it. He had to distinguish it from his own thoughts. Then he had to understand what the people were actually supposed to do, where to go, when to begin something, when to stay away, what was happening to the land, what was happening to the people. So the priest was not the boss of the gods. He did not command them. He was the person capable of hearing the message and carrying it into the human world. There was another method as well. A group of sufficiently developed people could gather together, not just a crowd that came to sing, shout, and create excitement. These were people trained to hold a shared state, a magical circle. They created one field, raised the frequency together, amplified one another, and because of that, they could reach higher than any one of them could alone. That is how every strong group works. Alone, you may not be able to reach the signal. Together, the field becomes denser, stronger, more focused. But there is a serious problem with group contact. A group can very easily invent something and convince itself that it is real. One person sees an image, the second person agrees, the third adds more details. Then the leader announces that it was definitely a great god, and 10 minutes later, everyone is convinced they have received a message of cosmic importance, when in reality they may have simply amplified a shared fantasy. So, group contact can work, but it is dangerous. It is very easy to confuse a real presence with emotion, expectation, or the influence of one powerful personality. That is why the most reliable method was always the place of power, because the connection already existed there. The crystal was already active. The tree was already holding the vertical axis. The altar point was already tuned, and the place itself was connected to a specific being. A person did not have to summon a god from some unknown part of the universe. He did not have to stand in a random field and scream into the sky. He went to a place where the channel was already open, where the contact had existed not for one day and not for one generation, but for centuries. And from there, everything depended on the person's level. An ordinary person might simply feel that something was happening. He felt lighter, calmer, stronger. A necessary decision became clear. A more sensitive person could understand where the current came from and how the place was affecting him. A magician could perceive the actual structure, the crystal, the tree, the boundaries, the channels. And the priest could rise even higher and contact the consciousness behind the power. This is why sanctuaries were not built in random locations. First, people found the connection. Then they built the sacred space around it. They placed stones, created passageways, built the temple as a concentrator and a transformer. Everything was designed to gradually move a person out of his ordinary state and bring him closer to the center. So the ancient person was not calling a god into empty space. He was traveling to a place where the connection was already open. And that is why a place of power was not simply a beautiful point on the map. It was a point of communication, a meeting place, a place where the distance between a human being and the consciousness of another order became just a little smaller. You can see almost anything, especially if you want to believe it. You can close your eyes, build up an entire experience in your own mind, see a beautiful image, and decide that a great God has just spoken to you. That is very easy. So I test these experiences in a much simpler way. What changed afterward? Not in the same second, not at the level of, wow, that was intense, I understand everything now. I mean, what actually changed in your life? After that encounter, I had far more energy. And this was not just for one evening. For the next couple of months, I was almost overloaded with it. My entire state changed. It became easier to work, easier to make decisions. I stopped wasting weeks circling around questions that should have been answered much faster. Changes also began happening in my health. Not in the sense that I woke up the next morning and every problem had magically disappeared. No, but my body was clearly functioning differently. Processes that had been stuck for a long time began moving again. The same thing happened with money and work. New solutions began appearing. The right people showed up. The right situations came together. Things that had refused to work before suddenly began organizing themselves much more easily. But that does not mean a god simply gave me money. A bag of gold did not fall from the sky. That is not how it works. I changed. I had more strength, more clarity. I could see much faster where I needed to go and where I had no business going at all. I began noticing opportunities that I might have slept through before. And only after that did external events begin to change. First, your inner state changes. Then, your life begins reorganizing around that state. For me, this is one of the clearest signs of genuine contact. Something remains afterward. Not just the memory of an impressive vision. Energy remains. A new understanding remains. A decision appears that you could not reach on your own before. And real contact does not always tell you what you wanted to hear. Fantasy is usually very pleasant. It tells you how great you are, how special you are, how you have some enormous mission, how everyone else is asleep, while you are the only one who has awakened. In other words, it tells the human ego exactly what it wants to hear. Real contact may show you something very different. Where you are wasting your time, where you are lying to yourself, where you are spending your energy in the wrong direction, where you should have acted long ago, but you are still sitting there afraid. That is not always pleasant, but it is useful. Then time passes, and the information begins to confirm itself. You see that the experience was not random. One event connects with another. The right people arrive, the right roads open, and you begin to understand why you were shown that exact thing at that exact moment. There is another important sign. After genuine contact, you usually do not feel the need to run around shouting, "I was chosen! I spoke with a God! Everyone needs to listen to me now." Usually, the opposite happens. When you touch a consciousness of that scale, you understand very quickly how small you still are, how much you cannot see, how much you do not understand. Your ego does not grow, it gets hit over the head, and you become calmer. You simply watch what has changed inside you and where the process leads next. In my case, the changes were real. They did not all happen in one day. There was no magic button. But the connection was obvious. The encounter changed my state. And once my state changed, my life began changing with it. After that, I no longer wondered where the ancient gods had gone. The ancient gods never disappeared. They existed. They exist now, and they will continue to exist. And in every age there have been people capable of interacting with them. Not crowds, not every second person, but such people have always existed. Because this has nothing to do with whether someone lives in the ancient world or the modern one. It depends on the development of consciousness. One person sees only what he can touch with his hands. Another can already feel energy. A third can perceive how space itself is structured. And someone else can rise even higher and enter into contact with the gods. The gods, plural, because there are many of them. Different beings, different levels, different degrees of power, different scales of consciousness. Some are connected to one specific place, some to an entire region, some to a river, an elemental force, or a landscape. Some are connected to nations and civilizations, and others operate through enormous planetary processes. That is why the idea that there can be only one higher being, while every other form of higher consciousness must be denied, has always seemed deeply human to me, as though the entire universe were organized more simply than a small office. One boss upstairs, everyone else below, and 10 rules posted on the wall so no one gets confused. But reality does not appear to work that way. There are levels, there are hierarchies, there are countless forms of consciousness, and humanity exists somewhere within that ladder, not at the top, not at the bottom, somewhere in the middle of its journey. The problem is that most people are not especially interested in moving anywhere. Life is easier when everything has already been decided for you. Here are the rules, here is the correct road, here is the person you are supposed to follow. Just do not ask too many questions, do not investigate for yourself, do not test anything, do not develop your own perception. Simply listen and repeat. It is convenient. You do not have to think, you do not have to grow. You can simply enter the collective current and allow it to carry you wherever everyone else is going. But there is an old and very accurate image. A dead fish floats with the current. A living one can turn around and swim against it. Human beings are not so different. The crowd is always moving somewhere. The herd follows one road. Everyone becomes convinced that this must be the only road and that it must lead somewhere important. But the fact that millions of people are walking in the same direction proves absolutely nothing. A crowd can move in the wrong direction with enormous confidence, and it may even trample the person who stops and asks, "Where are we actually going?" That is why the idea that every road automatically leads to God sounds beautiful to me, but far too simple. A person can spend an entire lifetime walking in circles and call it a spiritual path. He can obey every rule, perform every ritual, repeat all the correct words, and never develop at all. Because development does not begin when a person joins a system. Very often it begins when he separates from one and starts walking for himself. It begins when he changes, when he becomes stronger, more honest, more conscious, when he learns to see more, to feel more deeply, to manage his own energy, to understand the space around him, and to stop blindly trusting everyone who promises to show him the one correct door, especially anyone who claims to have taken responsibility for all of his mistakes. You should not blindly believe anyone, including me. Test it, observe, look at what actually works, what changes your state, what makes you stronger, what expands your perception, and what simply turns you into an obedient member of a very large crowd. Honestly, I am no longer especially interested in arguing about religious systems. Every system exists for a particular level of development. Some people need simple rules. Some need the fear of punishment. Some need someone to tell them exactly what is allowed and what is forbidden. That is also a stage. But we should not confuse that stage with the highest level of consciousness. It is like elementary school. Elementary school is necessary, but it would be strange to finish first grade and decide that you now understand the entire structure of reality. The gods do not disappear simply because people forget about them. Their existence does not depend on human belief. They remain on their own levels. Many are still connected to rivers, mountains, ancient trees, crystals of the earth, and powerful points in the landscape. One person visits such a place and sees a park. Another senses that something is there. A third perceives the crystal, the tree, and the currents. And the fourth can perceive the living consciousness behind the entire system. Not because he was chosen, but because he developed to that level. This living map of the earth is what I explore in my book, The Secret Guide. I show how to recognize places of power, crystals of the earth, ancient sacred settlements, old trees, and forgotten energetic nodes. How to understand what exists behind the visible form of a place. What kind of consciousness may be connected to it? Why certain places seem to call a person, why others refuse to let him enter for years, and why, after genuine contact, it becomes impossible to see the world as nothing more than dead stones, random trees, and meaningless roads. The QR code is on the screen now. The link is also below this video. The ancient gods never disappeared. They are still here. One person can perceive only the outer form. Another can feel the energy. A third can understand the structure of the space. And someone else can rise to the level where genuine contact begins. So the real question is not whether you believe in the gods. Honestly, what someone merely believes does not matter very much. The real question is this: are you growing? Are you developing? Are you becoming stronger? Are you learning to see the world for yourself? Or are you simply floating with the current, wherever everyone else has already decided to go?